Okay, I think we're good. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Gilles Perez. I'm the product marketing manager of ocean freight visibility at Windward. It's a great pleasure to have everybody here today. I think we have an amazing webinar ahead of us. We called it Avoiding Disruptions with Port Insights. And we have quite the panel today, not to put any pressure on anybody, but I'm very excited to be hosting this discussion with the three of you. So thank you all three for accepting to join this discussion. I would like to do a quick round of introductions for the few people that may not know who each of you are. And then I will continue to introduce a bit about Windward, and then we'll dive into some questions about how you can leverage insights, and more specifically insights about port efficiency, congestion, how you can read them, how you can actually use them in your day-to-day. But before we do all that, let's, as I said, start with a round of introductions. So Linda, we'll start with you.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks for having me here today. Appreciate it. My name is Linda Dunn. I'm the faculty director for the Supply Chain Management Master's Program at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. And our program is, focused obviously on supply chain, but not just on procurement or logistics, but really end-to-end supply chain is what I would say. And it's differentiated in that it's practice-based, and we cater to students who have experience in supply chain. So a lot of our students are freight forwarding or logistics, or they've been with military. So we have a lot of background there. And as far as myself, I've been at Georgetown for 3 years now. Prior to that, I was in industry. So I was the vice president of supply chain and quality assurance. So both food safety from an operational perspective and sanitation, and then also supplier food safety. So I had that for a large food service company, and also retail in the airports and in the travel plazas. And so, like many on the call today, I've spent a share of my time really trying to get product on time, in full, at a good cost. So I can empathize.
That's amazing. Thank you very much, Linda. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Lars, we'll continue with you.
Yes, and also thank you for inviting me to come here. I'll make this short and sweet. I mean, I've been in the container shipping industry now for 21 years, most of the time working in various types of roles as analysts. I was almost a decade with Maersk as their chief analyst, and for a while in charge of what today we call the commercial part of the digital portfolio. Then I've been an independent analyst and consultant in the industry since 2011, and tend to lend my expertise to all the different stakeholders out there. So from BCOs to forwarders to carriers to ports, terminals, authorities, technology companies, anybody who has an interest in the container shipping sector.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lars, and thank you for being here. Jason?
Yep. Again, thanks so much for having me on. Jason Miller, I'm the interim chairperson for the Department of Supply Chain Management of Michigan State. I do a lot of academic research, very much focused on macroeconomic phenomena, especially in trucking, which obviously touches on the import side. And then I teach our graduate level distribution fulfillment course in our master's program, as well as our integrated logistics system course to our MBAs.
Thank you very much. And on a personal note, I'll say that I personally very much enjoy reading all of your LinkedIn updates. I always find them very insightful. So for those of you that are listening and are not yet following these three amazing people, you should definitely do that straight away. So before we kick this webinar off, I just want to give the context of why Windward is hosting this webinar. Some of you may not be familiar with Windward in the context of supply chain. And that's understandable. We're kind of a new player in this industry, but we've actually been around for about 12 years. We started off doing maritime risk in the context of border protection and national intelligence, those kind of assessments of risks based on vessel vessel behaviors. We did that by creating what we branded Maritime AI, which is basically artificial intelligence algorithms that really understand how the ocean and the different stakeholders of the ocean work and how they behave, and can really understand the nuances between something that would be completely innocent and something that may pose a risk of an illicit behavior. So that's where everything started off. We've since evolved into adjacent, I would say, industries. We supply due diligence and compliance solutions. We do carbon emissions. And of course, since February, we've expanded into the supply chain, basically leveraging the same maritime AI for different purposes. In our case, we leverage it in order to create what we believe is the most accurate ETA predictions for vessels based on machine learning, deep learning models. We can reach an accuracy of 77% accurate ETAs 5 to 10 days before the arrivals. We also have geofence ports, which is relevant in the context of our discussion today, because this is what the Port Insights report, which is a totally free report, is basing most of the insights that you'll see today. So the geofencing means basically we're able to understand when vessels are coming in and out of ports and terminals, not based on any other information than the actual location in real time of those vessels. That gives us a lot of very insightful data, and some of it hopefully you'll see today and find it interesting. So again, the Port Insights is a totally free report, which most of you have received in your email after you registered, but those that haven't, you will all receive it also after this webinar ends. And so we do offer, of course, a service that is based on this concept for a customized list of port and terminals. So we do this for the report has 39 ports in it, but we can also do it for any port and terminal. So without further ado, I want to talk about the name of the webinar, Avoiding Disruptions. Clearly, avoiding all disruptions is very difficult. But I think you can certainly, do your best to mitigate them and improve the way you mitigate them and become more resilient to their impact. So, one of the most discussed disruptions of the past 2 years in supply chain has been port congestion. And I think that there's probably no need to explain what port congestion is, but I do want to talk about what you can do with that information. And we'll move on to this first slide, which is, again, a screenshot from the Port Insights. And what you see here is an analysis of 24 months of congestion inflation, basically the change each month in transit times, which is the way we measure congestion. It's basically transit time would be the time it took container vessels, of course, from the moment they left their previous port until they got to one of these ports here. And we compare them by region in order for it to be as accurate as possible. So you can see, for example, that Shanghai has had a pretty flat congestion inflation chart, showing hypothetically at least that there was, it's been coping with the very with the various changes in adverse events basically that happened there. For example, they had to close their ports multiple times because of the zero COVID policy. But I want to hear from the three of you, what do you think when you what do you get from this very clear different chart compared to all these other ports, these main ports in China? Maybe we'll kick it off with you, Lars. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are several things that you can take away from it. One of the things, at least that stand out to me, is how come you can get such a stable development in an extremely volatile environment. And to me, there's an underlying factor here. This, to some degree, illustrates, you can use two different words. You can either use the word resilience or you can use the word overcapacity. If you have a very resilient port, if you have a port that has an enormous amount of excess capacity, then by definition, then you won't get as impacted even of major disruptive events. So one thing is the data, you can see how does this develop month by month. But if I was a shipper, I would partly also use this to get an idea of what is the risk exposure to me in different ports, because this shows how quickly or how slowly things tend to spiral out of control. I cannot predict next year, is there any particular port that's going to be adversely affected by a new weird development. But what I can use this for is to get a gauge for, are there some ports that are more resilient than others? And if I'm lucky in my supply chain, I might be able to make a choice between a few different ports, and I might then choose one that's more resilient.
So on that, I think there are different ways of measuring port congestion. I've definitely come across a few, and as I said, we measure it at Windward based on transit times. But I've seen people measure it based on the number of vessels waiting outside of the ports. And what's your take on this? And what do you think is the best way to measure port congestion? And also, what do you think? How do you think that shippers and forwarders should leverage this type of information? Maybe we continue with you, Linda.
Sure. So like most business metrics, you don't have just one metric, right? You don't just focus on EBITDA, or you might forget your revenue. So I like to triangulate when you look at it a little bit. And I would say certainly transit times is very important. I would also say you want to look just at yard utilization would be another measure. And then just also looking at total port hours per ship call or the vessel turnaround time, each showing a little bit something different. That's important. And so I think, as Lars said, this can just tell you, how much volatility there is, and you want to look at the different metrics that are out there. I would also say that, when Lars mentioned the overcapacity, absolutely. It's also about supply and demand, right? Just how much capacity is out there. And Jason touched on it a little bit, but I would also say, just looking at the efficiency of your inland, both delivery to the port and your offloading as well. What's the efficiency, right? So it's all connected.
Thank you, Linda. Jason, anything you wanted to add on that?
No, not really, other than, again, there is no one perfect metric. It's trying to see what that combined story has to tell you. And so it's a very, very useful data point. I would say, especially as you think about, shippers, if you are a shipper of high dollar value product, like let's say Best Buy, transit times are going to become very, 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 you're going to have more weight to that versus if you're Dollar General, because your carrying cost of any of your pipeline stock is going to be so much higher. And so I would say that's even one where if you're a higher dollar value shipper in terms of dollars per, cubic foot of freight, transit time is probably going to receive more weight just because your pipeline stock is so much more important to your overall cost structure.
Yeah. Sorry, Lars, yeah.
Yeah, no. Another thing I think is important to bring into this discussion as well is how comparable data are between different ports, because that's one of the challenges as well. Measurements like this one is port agnostic. It's measured on the same basis, so you can make a reasonable comparison between ports. You have other measurement points, like, for example, how many vessels lie in queue outside. That quickly becomes a lot more subjective. How do you count that? How do you geofence it? How do you include vessels that are just going half their normal speeds in order to avoid sitting in a queue? You also have other parameters like ports measuring dwell time, for example. But again, ports tend to measure differently. Some of them only provide the data and an extreme lag. So one thing that to me is important when I try to gauge not the situation in one particular port, but across the board, is the ability to have a reasonably consistent measure across the different ports.
So absolutely, and we'll come back to that with a specific example in LA and Long Beach. I think is a great example of why that doesn't necessarily work in terms of measuring the number of vessels waiting outside. But staying just a little bit on Shanghai, maybe I'll come back to you, Jason. Shanghai is famous for being very, very advanced in its automation abilities. How much of a role does that play into the ability to cope with congestion?
I mean, it certainly does play a role, but I'd say, again, even more important is the capacity side. Because if you've got an automated system, but it's still running at 90-95%, you don't have that much wiggle room versus if you're, let's say, the magic threshold we always teach in queuing theory is 80%. Once your capacity utilization gets beyond 80%, waiting times start to increase in essentially an exponential manner. And so I think that that's, something that we can think about. And even when you hear, right now, and you see the vessel queue getting cleaned out on the US West Coast, the first thing you hear is, well, capacity utilization is 70%. And that's the type of, utilization you would have, that queues are not going to build up that much.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, Linda, you think when you look at a port and you hear about its automation, because they publicize that quite a lot when a port goes through a transformation, it uses automation more. How much weight would you put into that versus what Jason said, and maybe other factors when you choose which port to ship into?
So I'm going to go with exactly what Jason said. I mean, it's the capacity is more important. So more and more you're seeing the automation. That's great. We'll see more autonomous vehicles. We'll see, the efficiency of the cranes. Everything is getting more automated. But and you definitely want to look at that, particularly when you have labor issues. But that alone can't be the measure. So I think it really is about the capacity that you're looking at more so. And I think in the future, you see a lot of, comments about smart ports, right? And they're talking about what they're doing as far as, just big data, IoT, et cetera. You'll be looking at that too, because you want to look at working at things differently, not just the automation, but actually, is there better information? Is there more reliable information from that port? Just like we're going to be looking at sustainability by port and things like, are they providing, charging power? So you don't have to, continue to run the ships and things like that. So I think you look at a lot of different factors, but capacity is really a strong one.
Okay, thank you. So let's look at an example in Europe, and we see here that in Germany, Hamburg and Bremen, the port of Bremen, are pretty close one to another. The two major ports in Europe, and yet you can see in this graph right here, you can see that Hamburg experienced two very important spikes in transit times. First in April 2022, and then right around August 2022 of this year. And you can see these are very considerable spikes, and yet these are two very close by ports. So if I'm a shipper that needs to import some goods from whatever region into Germany, is it as straightforward as that? And looking at these graphs, is it as straightforward as that and say, I'll ship to Bremen? What other considerations are in play here? Maybe we'll start with you, Lars.
Yeah, well, the first thing that's in play here is the timing element of it. Because one thing I couldn't use this for is to say, okay, now I see a spike in Hamburg, then I'm going to change my booking, because that spike happens a month after my cargo was loaded on board the ship anyhow. So I couldn't use it tactically in that way. What I would use it for is, again, to gauge my risk exposure. Do I see a consistent pattern over time where some ports experience larger spikes than other ports? That tells me if I got cargo that is extremely time sensitive, I might actually want to choose the port that has a lower risk of these spikes. That might then add some cost, or it might even add some time. It might be a port that requires an extra day of transportation time, and then I can make up my risk management from that perspective. If I have cargo that is not time sensitive at all, I might not have a problem with a port having these spikes if I can just get it at a decent price. So I would use that in my considerations on how do I manage the risk profile of my supply chain when I choose the different ports. But I would not be using it tactically. This week, am I going to book to port A or port B? Because you would not be able to do it at that level.
That makes sense. And Jason, talking about a different type of data point that you can use, port call duration, which basically looks at how long it takes for vessels from the moment they go into what we geofence as the area of the port, and then until the moment they come out of that area. So the in and out of, or the turnover time for different vessel sizes as well. Again, two very close by ports. You have I guess you have a pretty straightforward choice. You can use both maybe, and then you look at this and you see very large differences in port call, the average port call duration, especially for the large vessels. There's quite a, it's more than twice longer in Hamburg versus Bremen. So What do you make of this entire slide with data about these two ports?
Yeah, so I like how you split that out by vessel size, because that is one very important consideration, is if you've got dramatically different sized vessels, even if two ports are relatively close to each other geographically, you are measuring apples and oranges. So just focusing on that, again, it's coming down to efficiency. If you're having a much longer, time lapse between when you're entering the geofenced orbit versus when you are leaving that orbit, that would be suggesting to me, more congestion issues at that port, or for sure lower productivity. I think one of the challenges too we're going to be having to deal with as we move into 23 is we had such, odd events over these last really, 24 months, is starting to think about, okay, what is the baseline level that we will, that we would want to be looking at as we move forward in the future. And so, I mean, even thinking about, for example, Hamburg, well, where do we expect things to eventually come back to once we get into, let's say the middle of 2023? And so I think that's one thing we'll be struggling with as we just see how the global economy evolves.
Okay, thank you, Jason. And just to continue on that point, maybe Linda, I'll turn it over to you. This is another example, kind of similar in terms of the use case here. You have two ports that are relatively close to each other, about 100 miles away from each other, and yet the transit times are very, very different. So I mean, what do you make of this if you're a shipper in that area?
Sure. You could say Savannah might be a victim of its own success to some extent, right? But as people looked at what was happening on the West Coast, both with labor and with congestion, and more people were moving to East Coast ports, Savannah looks attractive because it's a larger port than Charleston, for example. It also has rail, and Charleston doesn't. So, how are you getting your cargo out? It's not just the time. So I think looking at the size of it, they've both grown, right? When you look at year over year, January through October, but Savannah's grown more. So they've definitely been successful at attracting that. And again, you just have to look at the fact that it's larger, so you couldn't necessarily all just move to like a Charleston. And then you have to look at the infrastructure, and having rail is a big difference, and Charleston not having rail is a difference, depending on, the type of contracts, the costs, what people are managing. So it's improving over time, but yeah, there's still those differences there. The other thing I would say is, schedules, right? So if you look at the schedules, that plays a role into it too. And then, that's going to change the metric to some degree as far as the transit times. The other thing that we've likely seen is that as you had the congestion in Savannah, people just omitted the port of Charleston, right? And they dropped their goods there. So you have a lot of different things going on. And so it's not one factor, I think, that's causing that difference, but I do think it's the infrastructure is different. And then again, just once you have that congestion and backup, the behaviors really that happen of maybe omitting other ports. So
that actually is a good transition to the next point, which is looking at data that analyzes TEU capacity of vessels, container vessels sailing into the different ports. So we analyzed that over all the ports that are in the report, about 39 ports. Some of them stand out in terms of looking at how the trend has been going for the past 24 months. And one reason we look at the TEU capacity of these vessels is for the same reason that you mentioned, Linda, previously, is to kind of assess if there is a trend of port omission or blank sailing, those kind of things that are happening in different ports. And we see one thing that may or may not be related to that, but I want to hear your inputs on that. And Lars, I remember when I showed this to you, you kind of that spiked your interest, and so I'd love to hear your input on what do you make of this graph of Vientiane, especially compared to the other two that are up there?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is a pretty good way of illustrating just how disruptive an event sometimes is. I mean, what you're seeing in Yantian here was this massive shutdown you had of the terminal back in 2021. Now, of course, today, I was about to say, we are used to China constantly being in lockdown in different places. But if we think back to early summer 2021, this is when the world was beginning to open and suddenly Yantian shut down again for about 4 weeks. And I remember running the numbers back then and coming up with that the impact, the amount of capacity that was impacted made this a larger disruptive event than the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. But it was just not as visually appealing for people to look at. And bringing some of the data out in some of these ways actually help to convey that message that this is actually an extremely large and disruptive event. And to me, it's also one of these things where when you measure disruptive events like this, when the disruptive event happens, you couldn't necessarily predict it. But when you then quickly get a measure of just how big a deviation is this, you also immediately start to get a sense for what's going to be the reaction on the other side, because disruptive events are also resolved. And that gears you up for what is the opposite disruptive force that you should already start planning for on the backside.
Thank you, Lars. Jason, Linda, anything you wanted to add on that? If
No,
not-
I the one thing that to me is, is stunning when you look at this graph. You had a few slides previously, the explosion of transit time to Yantian, and then you can see this right here. And I think again, this is where the multiple data points tell the full story. That together you could see that magnitude of the disruption that took place, and that shows up very clearly when you take a look at how TEU capacity just plunges in June of 21 and then aggressively rebounds itself. And this is where I think too, you can take a look and say, okay, if this port sees that TEU capacity decline, do we see it diverted to other ports and which ones? And, again, trying to quantify what are these effects.
And if I can just add another comment also in terms of what such data can be used for, they're useful beyond what they just show. So let's say in real time, you were able to get this data and you see in June, okay, we know Yantian is shut down, you get a quantification. That immediately also tells you, okay, hang on a second here in Yantian, you get about 700,000-800,000 TEU of capacity less coming in, or at least you cut it in half. All things equal, that also means you are now getting half the amount of empty containers discharged into the Yantian region, which means in the weeks and months ahead, you're going to fall short by X 100,000 of empty containers. And again, that sets up the stage for another element that you're not measuring directly here, but this is a strong implication of what are going to be some of the downstream effects that will for sure impact the supply chain because of this.
Thank you, Lars. I want to connect. Jason, you were talking about the relationship between the increased transit time in Yantian and the TEU capacity. And so here, in taking the example from Oakland, you can see that pretty clearly. You can see basically here on the left side, you can see the change in similar to what we saw with Yantian, the change in TEU capacity month over month, and you can see it's a very different chart. I mean, there's extreme spikes, both ways, and that pretty much starts to go, very, very extreme around February 2022, which is around the same time, which is actually, sorry, it started off in March. Sorry, the increase was in March 2022, which is just the following month after there was an 88% increase in February of transit times to Oakland. So this is pretty impressive, and you can definitely, I think, see the impact. But I want to hear what you think of this, Jason. And by the way, you don't see this kind of graph. The graph is very different when you look at LA and Long Beach. So again, 3 ports that are very, very close to each other, having very different effects.
Yeah, I'd say part of this too with Oakland is, again, it's, somewhat as Linda brought up with with Charleston being smaller than Savannah. Oakland is much, much smaller than the Los Angeles Long Beach complex. So part of the volatility is likely just due to it being a smaller port. But I'm trying to remember back what it would have been specifically in February of this year that would have potentially caused this. But it's certainly, again, it's data points that are corroborating, but for the life of me, I do not remember what the disruption was in sort of that February 2022 period that would have caused the spike in transit times there, but also a substantial decline in TEU capacity relative to January.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
If you allow me, I would venture at least a view on why it is that we are seeing this one, because it's actually not an event as much in Oakland. I see this more as a consequence. Remember, in January, this is when we reached the very apex of the congestion problems down in Los Angeles, Long Beach. This is where less than 10% of vessels arrived on time, and the average delay of vessels at that point was around 19 days coming into LA and LB. And for a lot of the carriers, Oakland is kind of just an add-on after you call Los Angeles, Long Beach. And reaching the apex of the problem, carriers just started slashing the calls in Oakland. You can't completely drop Oakland, so every once in a while, then they send up sweeper vessels to pick up the empties. And by the way, this created a lot of problems for a lot of the agri exporters in US because they tend to use Oakland for their exports. So you get this pendulum swing up and down. No, we can't be bothered going to Oakland. We're just going to clear the vessels. And then the week after, oh my God, we need to send a sweeper vessel up to Oakland.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so if you're a shipper, again, shipping into this area, and you may have all three options open to you, and you see this kind of graph, again, trying to make it actionable for shippers and forwarders, if you see this, well, it's great to look at it and see the impact of different and the correlation between different events. But if you see this, do you prefer, not to ship? Do you take this into consideration in terms of, maybe I don't ship to this one because it seems to be highly unstable and vessels seem to be skipping this port, and maybe I take one that has a flatter graph in that aspect. What do you think of this? Any one of you, they want to take this?
Yeah, I would just say that, certainly as you look at variability and consistency of that variability, that's a concern, right? So it's not just a one spike. So you would definitely look at that, and where you see that level of sustained variability, I'll call it, that makes it potentially more risky. But sort of as Lars was saying, you see this action reaction that happens. And as people are planning out, they have to look at where is everyone else going to, right? So if you're just moving exactly where everyone else is moving, you're going to move to the next big congested area. So you really, I think it's being planful and figuring out, okay, what does it look like? I think a lot of bookings are going here, or, what are other people doing, and actually doing something different than what everyone else is doing, or you're just moving the mess a little bit.
Just to add on that, the problem we're up against, of course, is, let's go back to the example we had before with the congestion appearing over in Savannah. That was obviously also a consequence of the West Coast congestion. And when people are under stress, our supply chain doesn't work through the West Coast. Let's go to the East Coast. And since you're looking for safety and stability, the primary choice would be a large port that which of course is going to create a problem for that large port. But it becomes one of these self-sustaining prophecies. I want to find something stable, then everybody does that, and that very thing becomes unstable.
Right. All right, so I'm going to skip this one for a minute. I want to go to the question about the situation in Asia, and these are, again, the congestion analysis of the past 24 months in the major ports, in some of the major ports in Asia. And there's an interesting trend that seems to be happening. It seems like, even though, they all seem to be pretty flat, and it seems like they've been handling congestion and different types of adverse events pretty well in the past 2 years. But at the same time, it seems like in recent weeks and months, some of the ports have had the highest increase in transit times of the past 2 years, even if it's 10%, which is relative to the other regions, it's considered small. But this is how it starts, right? It starts with one small increase, which may have a domino effect on multiple things. And so my question to you, and maybe we hand it over to you, Lars, what do you make of this? Is congestion building up in Asia, do you think?
At least I would say, apart from the data anecdotally over the last month and a half, that does indeed appear to be the case out there as well. I haven't seen real solid evidence as to why, but my own hypothesis, if you look at a place like Lam Chubang in Thailand, for example, part of what is ongoing out in Asia right now is a lot of importers, especially in Europe and the US, try to shift part of their procurement out of China. And the obvious solution there are other places around Southeast Asia. That puts the supply chain under stress because it has not been designed to handle such a shift. I'm not saying everybody's moving out of China right now, because that would be a wrong way to put it, but you don't have to move very many percent out of China in order for that to create a very significant effect in some of the other Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And Jason, as a region with a lot, that serves as a major transshipment hub for shipments coming over from China mostly, or from all parts of Asia to different parts of the world, is there any concern to shift to other other options of transshipment? Are there any other transshipment options open to shippers?
I mean, in terms of, substituting away from, let's say, Singapore as a transshipment hub, not really. Just really isn't possible. Part of the issues with Korea too, I believe they're looking at another port strike with truckers there, so that could also be perhaps starting to get around to play a role. I think the one challenge too we'll have is, as global demand has cooled, as we think about transit times, and Lars brought this up earlier, is you've got very high energy prices coupled with slowing demand. One natural response to that is sort of slower steaming. And so do we start to have a way of thinking about not only transit times, but also average vessel speed? Because to the extent, in some cases, we may be seeing transit times increase because certain loops or certain stops in a loop are being eliminated because there isn't the demand there, and that may be resulting in longer apparent transits. I think we'll have to think all of this through very clearly as we move into 2023, because that's again where any single metric, there's always numerous other things we need to take into consideration.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Jason. So staying on the topic of 2023, you can't come to the end of November without talking about having a forward-looking statement about what's coming. So I want to ask the panel, and whoever wants to start, take a stab at it first is welcome to do it. But I've heard some experts say that supply chain is expected to go back to normal around Q1 of 2023. First of all, do you agree with that statement? And also, what is normal? What is the normal situation that we are expected to go back to?
Let me take first crack at that one. The answer is both yes and no. It depends on what do you mean? Because is the entire global supply chain at every node going to be back to normal in Q1? That sounds highly unlikely, to put it mildly. Are you going to have pockets that are going to be performing better? Absolutely, yes. We do have an overall trend towards supply chain problems easing. The complete collapse in demand helps because that creates excess capacity in the system. But that doesn't mean everything is going to be fixed everywhere. We still have some lingering issues. Again, the latest CTS stats was from September, where Asia North America volumes were down 25%. That is now beginning to be reflected in US port stats in October, obviously, with a time delay, also showing that demand collapse. Yet what has not happened is a swing of cargo from the East Coast back to the West Coast. Pre-pandemic, the normal state of affairs on Asia North America was 2 containers into the West Coast, 1 container into the East Coast. Right now, you're at parity, which means that even in a declining demand environment, port infrastructure on the East Coast will remain under severe stress. That is unlikely to be resolved until there is a deal with the Port Workers Union on the West Coast, because that is not the reason everybody moved over. It's part of the reason. And as long as that remains as a risk, it would be a high-risk strategy already now to move your supply chain back to the West Coast. So some pockets, yes, they'll be better, but not necessarily all of them. There's a second element of disruption waiting here. This complete collapse in container demand we see now is basically because we are in the midst of an inventory correction that always hits container volumes dramatically. But we also know inventories, they will come back down to normal at some point, and left on its own devices, this inventory correction will be done sometime in Q1. The question then becomes, what about the large global recession? Are we going to get a deep and long one, or is it going to be a short one? We might get inflation under control. Russia might give up next week. Who knows? So the point here is, if we get a short global recession, then you're going to see a massive spike in demand already over summer 2023. Because once you run down your inventories and the economy goes back to normal, you need to get the inventories back to normal running levels. So on the backside of an inventory correction, you always get a massive surge of cargo. So again, you could see congestion flare up already over summer 2023 with such a spike. On the other hand, we could be in for a deeper and longer recession, in which case that spike is not going to happen in summer. It will happen, but it will happen later. In that case, likely in the run-up to Chinese New Year 2024, but the timing is extremely uncertain.
Thank you for this analysis, Lars. Linda?
Yeah, first of all, I don't know what the definition of normal is anymore. So if I use stable as maybe a proxy for that, there's many factors that are working against it, and Lars really hit on a lot of them. But you've got the war in Ukraine, China's zero COVID policy that keeps popping up, and we've talked about that. Each time there's an issue, it reverberates, right? It hits everything else. We still have tremendous labor unrest, and it's not just the ports, it's truckers, as Jason mentioned. I mean, that's a general labor movement, I would say, that isn't dying down. We have historically high inflation, which is changing people's ability to purchase, et cetera. And then we have high fuel costs. So if I take all of those 5 factors and say we're going to be normal or stable, I'll call it, in 2023, I'm not sure I would bet on that one.
Thank you, Linda. Jason?
So I guess on the inventory side, when we look at Walmart and Target, they've moved very aggressively to correcting their inventory situation. Home Depot looks a little better as well in their most recent release. So I think, consistent with what Lars said, the excess retail inventories piece that has been an overhang, I think will start working itself out through the first, if not second quarter of 23. Right now, I think things are very mixed. I'm very US centric in my focus and much more industrial focused in what I look at. We just this morning had an October advanced durables goods manufacturing report that showed 1% increase in new orders in October from September, and demand staying very strong on that front. So I think the question of will the supply chain be normal, it depends what we're talking about. Certainly on the ocean side, trans-Pacific to the US West Coast, yes, it feels that we should, barring a strike, be very much back to pre-pandemic levels by Q1. Transatlantic East Coast, or transatlantic Europe to the East Coast, Lars, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but spot rates are still incredibly high, and we've seen a tremendous resurgence in US-European trade activity both ways. So that certainly is far from normal right now. In terms of disruption, manufacturers are facing still rampant issues with material shortages here in the US. I don't look for those issues to be resolved at this point until late 2023, early 24, barring some type of massive recession that, at least from the US standpoint, doesn't seem to be in the works at the moment. So I think it really depends, what aspect of supply chain you're looking at if we're talking about normal.
Thank you, Jason. So just being mindful of the time we have left, I want to move on to closing thoughts. And so we talked about multiple things here. We talked about the importance of measuring congestion. We talked about different ways to measure congestion and how transit times plays into that. We talked about the importance of other factors as well. For example, the turnover times and multiple other things. And we talked about how different different ports that are close by to each other can have very different behaviors and very different be affected very differently from different adverse events. So with all of the things that we talked about, all of the information that we've shared today and our insights on them, anybody wants to take a first step at closing thoughts with, what should our viewers take from all the information we've shared today?
I mean, if I take first crack at it, I mean, if I'm in the shoes of a shipper out there, the one thing I would not do is try to predict what 2023 is going to be like. I will not try to predict what my freight rate will be on average. I will not try to predict exactly what my transit time will be, because reality is it's going to be extremely fluctuating. I would go at it from the opposite approach. I would look at my portfolio of cargo, split it into what is particularly time sensitive, what is not so sensitive. And then I would make a risk-based approach and say, fine, for my time sensitive cargo, where are there services, ports, connections that at least are less impacted on average by disruptions? I couldn't predict it accurately, but this is a statistics game. So I would choose the more robust and resilient ones. And then I might play the market for the other ones for cargo that's not time sensitive. But the closing thought here in 2023 is, I understand shippers are yearning for normality, and the rapid decline in freight rates gives the illusion that we're coming back to normality. And we are on the rate level. Actually, rates are gonna go too far before they rebound. But operationally, we're not looking at a hope for real normality and stability until we get into 2024, and we're also through this inventory cycle.
Thank you, Lars. Linda, any takeaways?
Yeah, I think that we've seen a lot of variability, right? And I think no one has the crystal ball, just as Lars said. So what you really need to do is make sure you have your risk management plans in place. And what will I do when? Right? So your contingency plans, I think diversifying your transport risk is important. Just like people are looking at the +1 in sourcing, just looking at, have I put too much into certain trade lanes or just really looking at your risk profile and having strategy set out that if this happens, here's what I will do. And lastly, I'd say, this is, I think COVID has given us a new era of cooperation, honestly. It's not just lowest price. It is also consistency, reliability, and working together much more. So I think that will continue to be important. And so partnering and figuring out how you can be sharing the information and really connected, I think is going to be a big part of what gets us through this.
Thank you, Linda. Jason?
No, I think just to echo what was said is really thinking about risk profile, with the selection of not only sourcing countries, but also, ports of entry. Again, I'm US centric, so into the US as an example, or into Europe, I think is going to be absolutely critical. One caution I do have for everyone who is wanting to diversify, the number of countries they source from, is be very clear to ask yourself, are we doing a lot of consolidation at the outbound ports of shipments from multiple suppliers? You'll see that a lot with a Walmart as an example. If the answer is yes, then you're going to find it's much more difficult to leave, a very China-centric strategy, because you're going to lose some of those consolidation opportunities. You'll rely more on 20-footers and therefore being paying more than if you were all at 40-foot capacity. So I'd say there's a lot of nuance to these. Lars and Linda have highlighted that. So just be very cognizant that typically, a lot of, I'm going to say, the broad business press, discussions about some of these things of, it's going to be easy to leave China, or, sourcing capacities fleeing China. It's like that's not going to be the case. I mean, China is still an absolutely essential part of far too many industry supply chains that we're suddenly going to see, China falling by the wayside, but instead we're going to be seeing this diversification. And I think the other thing too is, again, a lot of, BCOs, were being chided earlier this year for signing contract rates that now appear incredibly elevated relative to spot rates. And my statement to that is it depends on your cost structure. If you are importing high dollar value product for which you have a high gross margin, paying $5,000 for a container, but having essentially guaranteed capacity may be a much better deal than paying $2,500 on the spot market for it. If the value of those extra three, getting it, here quicker and unloaded quicker may be worth tens of thousands of dollars. So I think shippers need to be very cognizant of how their cost structure impacts how they would go about sourcing ocean freight as they think about contract renegotiations here in 2023.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I don't think any of the shippers that entered into contracts, also to echo you, Jason, that they made a mistake in the beginning of 2022. At that point in time, it was still unclear. Of course, it was clear eventually that would come a market correction, but it was unclear when. So in the beginning of 2022, there was an equally high risk that peak season 2022 would create even more congestion and capacity shortage than last year. So it was prudent to safeguard your supply chain. What I've also seen was many shippers going into those contracts and in the back of their minds also having the thought, if the market then crashes, which it now does, they're going to renegotiate the contract, which is exactly what is also happening and what also happens. And what I'm talking to a number of shippers over the last month or so, I mean, my view on this is spot rates are going to continue crashing. They will likely bottom out in February and March after Chinese New Year. So especially on Transpac, which is key negotiation season, sure, you're going to be able to sign up contracts at ridiculously low rates. However, be careful what you wish for, because you might get that fantastic contract for a year. And if the market comes back over the summer, you're going to be highly unlikely to book a single container against that contract.
No, I agree. The one thing I'd tell folks, especially Transpac, to look at closely is what is the U.S. housing market doing? It's cooled down substantially. A lot of the things that we import go into new houses. If we start to see the Fed slow the rate of interest rates increase and we start to see housing maybe look stronger in 23 than it has in this back half of 22, that would be, to me, the one red flag piece, because if you look at the Transpac boom in the US, it correlates perfectly with our increased housing activity and people buying furniture and things like that. So that's, I think, a really good point.
All right, so thank you to all three. Actually, I forgot for a minute that I'm hosting this. I was going to continue listening to you guys speak, but it's for me, it's been a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. I hope that's been insightful to all our attendees. Of course, as I said, all of us are available on LinkedIn, and I think you can. Everybody will be more than happy to connect with you and continue the discussion. I apologize. There were questions in the chat, and I apologize that we weren't able to answer them through, in the webinar itself, but we'll do our best to send you the answers to those questions later on. I'll share them with the panelists, and we'll share the answers to those questions. So thank you for those that posed them, and of course we can continue the conversation through any media, including email if it's easier. As I said, Port Insights is completely free of charge, and it's been shared with you prior to this webinar. It will be shared again after this webinar for those that registered a bit later. And a new edition will be coming up in the first week of December, so look up for that. And by Monday next week, we will be sharing the recording of this session for all those that couldn't make. I know it's kind of a hectic period with Thanksgiving, really knocking on our doors already, and then there's the FIFA World Cup for those in Europe that follow that. So a lot of things are happening, but really thank you very much for all those that made the time to join us today, and of course to all three of you, Lars, Linda, Jason, It's been a great pleasure. So thank you once again. Yeah, we'll wrap it up here, I think.